Alaska has just delivered another reminder that some of its most important earthquakes do not necessarily come from the faults that dominate the maps. At 4:50 in the morning, UTC on August 8, 2026, a magnitude 5.6 earthquake struck approximately 57 kilometers, or about 35 miles, west-northwest of Skwentna in south-central Alaska. The United States Geological Survey placed the earthquake at approximately 62.27 degrees north and 152.31 degrees west, with a preliminary depth of about 10 kilometers, or 6 miles. Then the smaller earthquakes began appearing around it. What looked at first like a single magnitude 5.6 event quickly became something more interesting, a concentrated cluster of seismic activity, revealing that the crust beneath this remote part of Alaska was continuing to adjust after the main rupture. The most important clue may not be the magnitude itself, but the way the earthquake moved the rocks. The available focal mechanism information indicates predominantly reverse or thrust faulting, with the two possible nodal planes striking approximately 206 degrees and 4 degrees, dipping roughly 50 and 42 degrees, and carrying rake values of about 104 and 73 degrees. Those strongly positive rake values indicate that compression dominated the earthquake. One block of crust was pushed upward relative to another as the fault slipped. The moment tensor also contains an approximately 88% double couple component, indicating that ordinary tectonic fault motion overwhelmingly controlled the event. In other words, the earthquake appears to have been produced by the crust being squeezed rather than simply sliding sideways along the famous Denali Fault. That distinction is crucial because Alaska is often associated with one enormous structure, the Denali Fault. The fault stretches across a huge portion of the state and is one of North America's most recognizable active strike-slip systems, but the August 8th earthquake does not have the mechanism expected from a straightforward rupture of that fault. The Denali system is predominantly right lateral strike-slip, meaning that blocks of crust mainly move horizontally past one another. The magnitude 5.6 near Skwentna instead shows a strongly compressional reverse or thrust mechanism. The broader tectonic forces affecting the region can certainly connect these structures, but the earthquake itself should not be described as a Denali fault rupture. The more defensible interpretation is that a different structure within the complicated Susitna Skwentna deformation zone accommodated the accumulated stress. That region is far more complicated underground than a simple earthquake map might suggest. The Susitna Basin and the surrounding mountains contain a network of faults, folds, and buried structures that have developed through millions of years of deformation. Geological and geophysical studies by the United States Geological Survey have identified numerous reverse faults and thrust faults around the basin, with contraction broadly oriented east to west. Among the structures identified in the western Susitna Basin are the Skwentna and Beluga mountain reverse fault systems, along with other faults and folds that may be concealed beneath sedimentary deposits. This geological setting makes a reverse earthquake near Skwentna entirely plausible. The event appears to fit a regional pattern in which the crust is being shortened and thickened rather than simply pulled apart. That does not mean scientists can already point to one specific fault and declare that it ruptured. A focal mechanism normally provides two possible fault planes. One represents the actual rupture surface, while the other is an auxiliary plane that produces the same seismic radiation pattern. Without detailed aftershock relocation, additional seismic analysis, geological evidence, or another independent observation, identifying the correct plane remains uncertain. This is especially important in the Susitna region because several structures are buried beneath younger sediments and are difficult to observe directly at the surface. The magnitude 5.6 may have occurred on the known Skwentna system, a related subsidiary structure, or another concealed reverse fault. The safest interpretation is therefore that a shallow contractional fault within the broader Susitna Skwentna system slipped. The aftershocks could eventually provide the missing piece of the puzzle. When a significant earthquake ruptures a fault, the surrounding crust does not instantly return to its previous state. The rupture changes the distribution of stress around the fault, increasing stress in some areas while reducing it in others. Small nearby faults and fractures can then respond to those changes, producing additional earthquakes. Their locations are important because they can gradually outline the volume of crust disturbed by the main shock. If the aftershocks eventually form a narrow dipping pattern, that geometry could reveal the orientation of the fault that actually ruptured. If instead they spread through several structures, the sequence could indicate a more complicated network of interacting faults. Each small earthquake therefore becomes another piece of evidence about what happened several kilometers below the Alaskan landscape. The main shock did not simply ignite a chain reaction in which one earthquake automatically creates another. Instead, the rupture redistributed stress through the surrounding crust. Some nearby fractures were pushed closer to failure, and others moved farther away from it. The earthquakes that followed were responses to those changing conditions. Most aftershocks are smaller than their main shock and gradually become less frequent with time, although the decline is not always perfectly smooth. Occasionally, a later earthquake can exceed the original event in magnitude, in which case scientists retrospectively classify the earlier earthquake as a foreshock. That uncertainty is one reason seismic sequences are monitored closely during their earliest stages. The depth of the main shock is another important clue. The preliminary location places the earthquake at approximately 10 kilometers or 6 miles beneath the surface. That is shallow enough to place the rupture within the brittle upper crust, where rocks can fracture and suddenly slide along faults. At the same time, it is deep enough for the fault itself to remain completely hidden from view. At the surface, there may be forests, rivers, mountains, wetlands, and layers of sediment. Several miles below those landscapes, however, the rocks are subjected to enormous pressure and slowly changing temperatures. They are not motionless. Stress accumulates within them as tectonic plates and crustal blocks move. Most of that deformation is invisible to human observers. Earthquakes occur when local conditions finally allow a portion of the crust to overcome friction and release some of that stored elastic energy. The forces responsible for the earthquake did not begin on August 8th. They have been acting for geological periods of time. Across Alaska, the Pacific Plate and North American Plate interact within an exceptionally complicated tectonic environment, while the Yakutat microplate plays a major role in driving deformation farther north. The Yakutat block is being carried northward with the Pacific Plate and is colliding with the southern margin of Alaska. Its interaction with the North American continent has contributed to crustal shortening, mountain building, and the development of active faults. United States Geological Survey research identifies the collision of the Yakutat microplate as a dominant driver of active crustal faulting across much of Alaska. The magnitude 5.6 therefore represents only a tiny release within a much larger system that has been deforming the state for millions of years. That process is difficult to appreciate because geological deformation is normally far too slow to see. A block of crust can move only a few millimeters or centimeters during a human lifetime, while the forces responsible for that movement continue year after year. Mountains appear permanent, valleys seem fixed, rivers carve channels through landscapes that look almost unchanged from one generation to the next. But at depth, the crust is constantly responding to tectonic stress. Faults accumulate strain, folds slowly tighten, and rock masses shift relative to one another. Then, occasionally, a fault slips several centimeters, several meters or more within seconds. The earthquake near Skwentna was one of those moments. The landscape may look unchanged, but the rocks below it experienced a sudden mechanical transformation. The Susitna Basin is particularly valuable to scientists because its geology preserves evidence of this long-term deformation. Studies using seismic reflection data, gravity measurements, and magnetic observations have revealed structures that cannot easily be explained by a simple model of the basin being pulled apart. Instead, researchers have identified evidence for contractional deformation, including reverse faults, thrusts and folds. Some structures are believed to extend beneath thick sedimentary layers, meaning their most important portions cannot be seen directly at the surface. The Beluga Mountain fault system is one example of a major structure interpreted as a thrust fault beneath the basin. The Skwentna region also contains reverse fault systems capable of accommodating shortening. The new earthquake therefore occurred in a geological environment where compression is already an established part of the regional tectonic picture. One of the most fascinating details is that Alaska has already demonstrated how complicated fault interactions can become during a major earthquake. On November 3, 2002, a magnitude 7.9 earthquake struck central Alaska. It became famous as the Denali earthquake because the rupture eventually propagated along a massive section of the Denali Fault, but the rupture did not begin there. The earthquake initially broke along the Susitna Glacier thrust fault before transferring onto the Denali Fault system. United States Geological Survey research documented approximately 48 kilometers, or about 30 miles, of surface rupture associated with the thrust fault. That event showed that large earthquakes in the broader Denali tectonic environment can involve multiple types of faults. It also demonstrated why scientists should not assume that every significant earthquake in this region must originate on the main Denali Fault. The 2002 earthquake does not mean that the magnitude 5.6 near Skwentna is the beginning of another magnitude 7 or 8 event. There is no evidence that the current sequence is developing into anything comparable. The comparison is important for a different reason. It reveals the complexity of Alaska's crust. The state's tectonic architecture cannot be represented accurately by drawing one thick line across a map and labeling it the Denali Fault. There are secondary faults, thrust systems, buried structures, folds, and older fractures that can potentially be reactivated under the right conditions. Some structures accommodate horizontal movement. Others accommodate compression. Still others may absorb deformation through folding or distributed movement. The magnitude 5.6 provides another reminder that active deformation extends well beyond the most recognizable fault traces. The aftershock pattern could become particularly valuable because many of the structures around the Susitna Basin are difficult to identify directly. A fault hidden beneath several kilometers of sediment may leave no obvious scar at the surface. Yet an earthquake occurring on that structure produces seismic waves that can be detected hundreds of kilometers away. When many smaller earthquakes follow the main shock, scientists can compare their locations and depths to determine whether they form a recognizable geometric pattern. If those earthquakes align along one of the two nodal planes identified by the focal mechanism, confidence in the actual rupture orientation would increase. If they instead occupy a broader volume, the event could reveal deformation spread across several nearby structures. The continuing sequence, therefore, has the potential to turn an initially uncertain earthquake location into a much clearer picture of the hidden fault network. There is another reason the earthquake deserves attention. Its location is remote, but remoteness does not make an earthquake geologically insignificant. Skwentna is a small community surrounded by enormous areas of wilderness, mountains, rivers, and forests. A magnitude 5.6 occurring in such a setting will generally have a very different human impact from the same earthquake occurring directly beneath Anchorage or another densely populated area. Nevertheless, seismic waves travel outward from the source in every direction. The intensity experienced at the surface depends on distance, depth, local geology, and the characteristics of the structures being shaken. Soft sediments can amplify certain types of ground motion, while hard bedrock may respond differently. Even in remote Alaska, an earthquake can therefore be felt across a substantial area and can affect infrastructure or unstable terrain. Earthquake shaking also matters because of Alaska's rugged topography. Steep mountain slopes can already exist close to their stability limits, particularly where rocks are heavily fractured. Glaciers have modified the landscape, or previous landslides have weakened the terrain. A magnitude 5.6 does not automatically produce widespread landslides, and there is no basis for describing this event as a catastrophic slope failure trigger. But seismic shaking can provide an additional disturbance to slopes that are already unstable. In remote areas, even a relatively localized landslide can create practical problems by blocking access routes, damaging infrastructure, altering drainage, or temporarily obstructing a river. That is why earthquake monitoring in Alaska involves more than simply counting seismic events. Scientists also consider how shaking interacts with the physical landscape surrounding the earthquake's source. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of the earthquake is the way its mechanism connects the event to the long-term construction of Alaska itself. Mountain ranges are not created in one dramatic movement. They rise through countless episodes of deformation as the crust is shortened, thickened, folded and faulted. The same forces that eventually produce enormous mountain belts can also generate earthquakes on individual faults. A magnitude 5.6 event is tiny compared with the geological forces involved in building an entire mountain range, but it represents the same basic mechanical process operating on a much shorter timescale. Compression pushes rocks together. Faults accommodate part of that movement. Folds absorb some deformation. Stress continues accumulating. Eventually, another portion of the crust slips. The earthquake is therefore not an isolated disturbance imposed on an otherwise stable landscape. It is one moment in the continuing construction of Alaska. That broader picture helps explain why the earthquake should not automatically be treated as either meaningless or catastrophic. It is neither. A magnitude 5.6 is large enough to reveal important information about active faulting, but far smaller than the largest earthquakes Alaska can produce. The aftershocks do not prove that a larger earthquake is coming. Earthquake sequences cannot currently be used to predict a specific future earthquake with a precise time, location, and magnitude. Stress transfer can influence nearby faults, but the relationship is complicated and depends on fault geometry, friction, accumulated strain, and many other factors. The scientifically responsible conclusion is therefore much more measured. The earthquake demonstrates active deformation. It does not provide evidence that a major disaster is imminent. For now, the strongest interpretation is straightforward. The magnitude 5.6 earthquake near Skwentna appears to have been a shallow crustal earthquake produced primarily by reverse or thrust faulting. Its mechanism indicates compression, its depth places it within the brittle upper crust, and the surrounding aftershock activity is consistent with a sequence developing around the main rupture. The available evidence does not justify saying that the main Denali Fault ruptured, nor does it prove that the named Skwentna Fault itself was responsible. A buried or subsidiary reverse fault within the broader Susitna Skwentna deformation zone remains a strong possibility. The continuing aftershocks may eventually provide the evidence needed to distinguish between these possibilities and reveal the geometry of the structure that slipped beneath the Alaskan wilderness.